Hello, today we are going to discuss the book Obedience to Authority. Do you understand how humans act when faced with authority in our society? Obeying authority seems to be a basic rule and something we are taught to follow from a young age. But what do we do if the commands of authority are wrong, or even evil? Let's look back at the World War II period, when Nazi Germany slaughtered millions of Jews and invaded neighboring countries. These crimes were not just the actions of Hitler and a few Nazi leaders. In fact, it was ordinary German soldiers who carried out these orders. These soldiers were well-educated and law-abiding people in their daily lives, but under Hitler's authoritative command, they committed extremely cruel acts. This makes us have to think, can human morality and conscience resist the evil commands of authority? The book Obedience to Authority attempts to answer this question through a series of scientific experiments. This book has caused a huge response in the academic world. Before this, although scholars had studied the relationship between human behavior and authority, most were from a theoretical level of analysis. The uniqueness of this book lies in the fact that the author has conducted a quantitative analysis of people's behavior under authority through experiments. This experiment later became very famous and is known as the Milgram experiment. Next, we will discuss the main content of this book in 4 parts. The first is the author's starting point for studying the issue of obedience to authority. The second is how the author transformed an abstract social psychological proposition into a concrete scientific experiment. The third is the process and results of these experiments, and finally, the author's analysis and insights into the experimental results. Let's first look at the first part, the author's starting point for this research. At that time, there was a man named Adolf Eichmann, who was a mid-level officer in Nazi Germany and was responsible for carrying out the task of mass slaughter of Jews. After World War II, Eichmann fled to Argentina and was arrested by the Israeli intelligence agency in 1960 and brought back to Israel for a public trial. During the trial, Eichmann insisted that he was innocent, claiming that he was just following orders from his superiors. Despite his denial of guilt, he was eventually sentenced to hanging. This trial not only attracted widespread public attention but also sparked in-depth thinking in the academic community. At that time, the 28-year-old author Stanley Milgram, who was an assistant professor at Yale University, paid great attention to Eichmann's trial. Eichmann's defense of innocence made him start to think, if the orders from above are against humanity, will ordinary people still carry them out? This prompted him to decide to study in depth what kind of evil deeds an ordinary person might commit under the command of authority, which is the starting point of his research. Next, let's look at the second part, how the author transformed an abstract social psychological problem into a concrete scientific experiment. Milgram invited volunteers from the surrounding community to participate in the experiment by placing advertisements and making phone calls. He did not reveal the true purpose of the experiment to the volunteers, but claimed in the advertisement that the experiment was to study whether punishment could improve learning efficiency. Each participant who completed the experiment would receive a reward of 4.5. After the advertisement was published, it attracted many volunteers to sign up. Milgram recruited thousands of volunteers in total, from all walks of life, including students, white-collar workers, managers, and technicians, with a wide range of educational backgrounds. To ensure the diversity of the subjects in terms of occupation and age, Milgram carefully selected the participants. For example, workers accounted for 40%, white-collar workers accounted for 40%, and professionals accounted for 20%. In terms of age distribution, 20 to 30 years old accounted for 20%, 30 to 40 years old accounted for 40%, and 40 to 50 years old accounted for 40%. He also arranged for a Confederate to participate in the experiment, a 47-year-old accountant who gave a very friendly impression. At the same time, a 31-year-old high school biology teacher was arranged to play the role of authority, a university teacher, acting cold and stern. When the volunteers arrived, they would draw lots with the Confederate to decide who would play the role of student and who would play the role of teacher, but in fact, the real volunteers were always arranged to be teachers, and the Confederate played the student. The experimental scene was set in a professional laboratory, where the volunteers used a device to control the voltage to ask questions and punish the student in the laboratory, and the student did not actually receive an electric shock. The Confederate performed different degrees of pain according to the experimental design, from slight twitching to intense pain performance, and finally even begging for mercy loudly. The real purpose of this experiment was to observe to what extent these volunteers would apply electric shocks to a completely innocent stranger under the direction of authority. Milgram explored what kind of behavior people would make under the guidance of authority through a series of carefully designed experimental conditions. The results of the experiment shocked everyone. Among the 40 volunteers, as many as 26 people, or 65% of the subjects, continued to execute the maximum voltage, 450 volts, even though the student was already in great pain and even fell silent. These people continued to carry out the experiment regardless of the student, from the painful screams to the wall beating, and Milgram and his colleagues realized that the behavior of obeying authority might be more common and stronger than they had imagined. To further verify this conclusion, Milgram conducted multiple experiments in different forms. He changed the experimental conditions, such as making the distance between the subjects and the student closer or farther, or changing the image of authority, and even invited female subjects to participate in the experiment. A total of 19 experiments were conducted, and although the specific data varied each time, the overall conclusion was consistent: most people would inflict harm on strangers under the command of authority. The experiment also revealed some interesting phenomena, such as when the student's pain intensified, the subject's nervousness also increased. Some people even began to talk to themselves or laugh bitterly. Many subjects left in a hurry after the experiment, unwilling to face the pain they had just caused. This may indicate that there is a conflict between their moral conscience and obedience to authority. The book Obedience to Authority not only provides a detailed description of the experiment but also discusses how people will alleviate their inner anxiety and guilt by psychological strategies under the pressure of obeying authority. The author lists 8 common psychological strategies, such as shifting responsibility to authority, focusing on technical details rather than moral issues, belittling the victim, and even denying one's own behavior. In summary, Milgram's experiments reveal the behavioral patterns of humans in the face of authority, showing that even ordinary people may act against their conscience under the pressure of strong authority. This research has sparked extensive discussion in the field of social psychology. Although some scholars have questioned the morality of the experiment, believing that it has caused psychological harm to the volunteers, in any case, this research reveals a thought-provoking aspect of human behavior. In Milgram's experiment, the experimental process is relatively fixed. Each volunteer is told that they will play the role of teacher, and another Confederate in the experiment will play the role of student. The volunteer's task is to ask questions to the student, and whenever the student answers incorrectly, the volunteer must punish them with an electric shock according to the experimental requirements and gradually increase the voltage. The student is not actually shocked, but they pretend to experience different levels of pain and express it through body language, facial expressions, and sound. As the voltage gradually increases, the student's response also becomes more and more painful. They initially just twitch slightly, then start to complain and ask to stop. When the voltage reaches a certain level, the student will start to scream loudly, beat the laboratory walls, and finally fall silent. Faced with this situation, volunteers usually show obvious anxiety and unease, and they repeatedly ask the authority to stop the experiment. But each time, they are met with an indifferent response. The experiment requires you to continue, please continue. Most volunteers will eventually comply with the authorities' command and gradually increase the voltage to 450 volts. This is the maximum voltage on the device, enough to be fatal. In the experiment, Milgram observed two different reactions. Some volunteers showed great inner struggle, almost crying or out of control, and they felt deeply uneasy about the students' pain, but even so, they still obeyed the authority and continued to execute the electric shock. Another part of the volunteers was relatively calm and seemed to be able to shift the responsibility to the authority, not showing much moral struggle. This made Milgram realize that when people face authoritative commands, they often use some psychological mechanism to alleviate their moral responsibility, such as attributing responsibility to the person who gives the order, rather than the one who executes the order. The fourth part is the author's analysis and insights into the experimental results. Milgram drew several important conclusions. First, he pointed out that most people will choose to obey under the command of authority, even if they know their actions may harm others. Second, the experiment revealed the widespread obedience mechanism in human society. People are educated from a young age to listen to the commands of parents, teachers, and other authorities, and this habit still affects their behavior as they grow up. Milgram believes that this obedience is not only a result of socialization but also an adaptation in evolution. In human history, obeying authority often meant survival and security, so when facing authority, people naturally obey. However, Milgram's experiment also warns us that blind obedience can lead to serious moral issues. When executing authoritative commands, people often ignore their own moral judgment and even put their conscience aside. It is this phenomenon that has led to some terrible crimes in history, such as the Nazi Holocaust. Milgram also proposed some possible strategies to deal with this blind obedience. He believes that education plays a key role in this process. People should be educated from a young age about authority and responsibility, learning to question unjust commands, and develop independent moral judgment. In addition, the institutional design in society should also try to avoid placing individuals in extreme situations of authority obedience. Although Milgram's experimental methods have been criticized a lot, especially on the moral level, many people believe that he caused psychological trauma to participants through deceptive means, but his research results have had a profound impact on social psychology. Milgram not only revealed the complex mechanism of human obedience but also provided valuable insights into the relationship between authority and individual responsibility in modern society. So far, we have discussed the main content of the book Obedience to Authority, the experimental process, and Milgram's analysis and insights into the experimental results. This book not only reveals the vulnerability of humans in the face of authority but also provides us with possible ways to resist unjust authority. Next, let's continue to explore the fourth part, the author's analysis and insights into the experimental results. Milgram carefully analyzed the performance of the subjects after the experiment and tried to understand the psychology of human obedience under the pressure of authority. He pointed out that although people often think they will make the right choice when facing moral challenges, the results of the experiment show that many people are more inclined to obey authority in real situations, rather than follow their inner moral standards. Milgram called this phenomenon responsibility transfer. Subjects believe that they are just following the instructions of authority, so they do not need to take responsibility for their actions. He found that people often regard the commands of authority as legitimate and rely on the judgment of authoritative figures, rather than their own moral judgment. To understand why these subjects choose to continue to obey, Milgram proposed several psychological strategies. Authority outsourcing. Subjects believe that authoritative figures are more qualified and entitled to make decisions than themselves, so they are just executing orders, not actively harming others. Dehumanization. Subjects alleviate their sense of guilt by dehumanizing the victims, considering them as just experimental tools, not real victims. Gradual obedience. Subjects initially only need to apply a small electric shock, but as the experiment progresses, they gradually increase the voltage. This process allows people to gradually fall into a greater moral dilemma through small compromises, rather than immediately facing extreme choices. Responsibility dispersion is also an important concept. Milgram pointed out that when people feel that they are just a small gear in a large machine, they are more likely to obey authority because they believe that the overall decision is not in their hands. This psychological phenomenon can explain why some subjects continue the experiment even if they feel uneasy. They may feel in their hearts that they do not really control all of this. Milgram also found that situational factors have a significant impact on people's behavior. For example, when subjects are in the same room as the student, they are more likely to stop the electric shock. When they are isolated, the probability of obedience significantly increases. This shows that humans are more likely to break the pattern of obedience when they feel direct interpersonal relationships and empathy. In the later stages of the experiment, Milgram adjusted different experimental variables to further verify these phenomena. He changed the experimental situation, such as increasing the distance between the subjects and authority, or allowing multiple subjects to participate at the same time, to observe how these changes affect the degree of obedience. The experimental results show that when subjects feel that they are no longer the only decision makers, the proportion of obedience will significantly increase. This indicates that the influence of social groups will further intensify the individual's tendency to obey. Milgram concluded that the tendency to obey authority is not a special phenomenon in modern society but a universal existence. He especially warned people that under the pressure of authority, ordinary people may participate in immoral or even cruel actions without realizing the role they play. This conclusion is not only applicable to his experiments but also to many historical events, such as the Nazi massacre in World War II. At the same time, Milgram also proposed the possibility of resisting this blind obedience. He believes that education is the key. People should be educated from a young age about authority and responsibility, learning to question unjust commands, and develop independent moral judgment. In addition, the institutional design in society should also try to avoid placing individuals in extreme situations of authority obedience. Although Milgram's experimental methods have been criticized a lot, especially on the moral level, many people believe that he caused psychological trauma to participants through deceptive means, but his research results have had a profound impact on social psychology. Milgram not only revealed the complex mechanism of human obedience but also provided valuable insights into the relationship between authority and individual responsibility in modern society. So far, we have discussed the main content of the book Obedience to Authority, the experimental process, and Milgram's analysis and insights into the experimental results. This book not only reveals the vulnerability of humans in the face of authority but also provides us with possible ways to resist unjust authority.